sound check. Morning, and yeah, really good to be in Cape Town. I think it sounds like I missed out on quite a great event last night, the party, but luckily for me, I'm feeling refreshed this morning. So I think it's only myself standing between you and some of those much-needed refreshments afterwards, but I think a topic that I'm going to speak about is really what I'm seeing as us as a business, and I think as cybersecurity professionals out in the market. There's global trends, global cyber attacks, but 2 years ago, a lot of South African organizations, unfortunately, I do a lot of work with the higher education departments, but the trend was that we in South Africa, we're never going to be a target from a cyber attack perspective. Now, when we look at it, I'm going to take you through the process in terms of the cyber attack chain, but it's also key in terms of understanding. I think Isak really mentioned it in terms of the economy, where the economy is going. You know, I remain positive. The same when we look at cyber attacks. We are probably one of the biggest targets, I think, in the last year, with the third highest target in the world now from a cyber breach perspective. And that's really with the key to get to sensitive information, causing disruption. Now, these are just global stats, but to just bring it into terms, if we look at one key thing that stands out here is that 212 days. Typically, if I had to make a statement here, your security teams might not be here or your IT directors, but how confident are you that your organization or the department where you work at has not experienced a cyber breach within this last 6 months? Just something to think about. If you can confidently say, absolutely, we've got all the controls in place, we haven't experienced a breach, you know what, that just proves that it's at a more mature security posture. When we look at it around budget, and I think this is definitely something that's close to my heart, is always look at security teams identify a risk within your organizations, and typically what gets done, they go purchase a solution to only secure that part of the security gap in your organizations. That leads to what we call wasteful expenditure. And that really adds to additional risk from a governance perspective as well as procurement, because is the solution a right fit? How does that increase your total security posture? Typically, a couple of years ago, your C-level executives never had the visibility. But it's really come down to, as you identify risks within your organizations, from a business perspective, is aligning and translating cyber risk to business risk, because that's going to lead to who's accountable, drive the strategy within the organization to actually mitigate those risks. The next looks at following a layered approach. Now, when we look at layered approach, it does not always include technology. It looks at processes and the people that forms part of that. You might have solutions already, security platforms deployed within the different higher education departments that's there to serve a purpose, but the full capability and capacity is not being used. And then operationalize resiliency, and when we look at that from that aspect is, how resilient are you to be able to recover from a data breach? Do you have capacity to actually be highly available? When we look at it, exams coming up now, a lot of these malicious actors follow what we call seasonal attacks. So they know that examinations are coming up and they're trying to get to that sensitive information. In some form or shape, a lot of these exams are in a digital format, safeguarded on a platform, whether it's in the cloud or even on-prem. So it's really around how do you protect the data and as well as recover the data. Now, when you look at it, it really talks to how what we call a strategic blueprint is to be able to have a strategy within the organization and get the budget's approvals. It's really around, you first need to understand what your risk profile is. Once you understand what your risk profile is, that would lead to, as an example, what's your tolerance level from a risk perspective, what's acceptable. And that typically then gets categorized around what's seen as a high risk, is it a medium risk, as well as a low risk. Reduce your attack surface. Now, attack surface, if we look at how digitalization has accelerated over the last few years, with that, your attack surface has also increased. You as organizations especially from higher education, because that's where I see this quite often, have expanded to adopting cloud services. That might be for, as an example, online portals for students. What's the impact thereof? And then really around controls. Now, a control is good to have. What we see quite often, and the maturity, one positive that's really good in South Africa is the maturity level is definitely increasing. The reason for that is a lot of organizations have controls in place, but how do you measure the effectiveness of all those controls? Now, a question I get asked quite often when I meet with different departments and even schools, right, is around why has education become a key target? So we all know the regulations around POPI, personal information, is faculty and students in a lot of organizations, the student and faculty interconnectedness is not separated, but there's key information which attackers are trying to get to with malicious intent, identity theft. But that includes information such as student loans. So someone applies to do a course or do their degree. Information, part of their application could include their bank account details, their identity numbers, so the student loan aspect, because that's the data, the personal information has become a new commodity. Infrastructure and disruption. This is something we see quite often as well, is where next month as well now, I think it's these new campaigns coming out around the world around Black Friday deals. Typically attackers are going to expose that. But from an education perspective, when enrollment opens up for the next semester or for the following year, attackers are going to leverage on those seasonal campaigns. They're going to try and get through what we call the human firewall. That's each and every one of us. We are working on a corporate connected device that's connected to infrastructure. They use emotions as well as these seasonal campaigns to get someone to click on a link that redirects them to a website that click here to enroll at 50% discount. And the sad part is people are falling for that. And because these attackers are playing with the emotions of students, the economy is really tough. But the next is digitized classrooms. Now we all use collaboration tools out there. We work remotely from anywhere in the world. However, looking at the adoption of a digitalized classroom, this is now where you've got your students that are attending virtual online classes, training rooms. However, they become a big target because the same governance and security policies that's dictated for the faculty side is not necessarily applied to the student aspect. So where the risk comes in is you've got your students that communicate with your faculty, and the students don't have something simple, with it being Cyber Awareness Month now, strict password policies. Typically what I see quite often when I do these vulnerability scans, it's typically like a password 1 or someone's using just a month with a 01. So that's where the risk comes in. They are using the students to actually expose vulnerabilities. Now when we look at it, to actually identify your risk profile, there's a methodology that talks to what's seen as defensible and what's seen as negligent, the thresholds. So when we look at what's defensible means, that is really around you are, as an organization, you know exactly you're being proactive, you know what your objective is to actually defend against cyber attacks, whether it's with malicious intent or even human error, people that might be sharing sensitive information through any of these communication channels by mistake. Negligence is quite a big thing, and the reason for this, why this is probably one of the more important aspects, is really around a lot of the higher education departments still have on-premise infrastructure, which is typically hosted. They've got servers where you connect to applications hosted in their own infrastructure. But a lot of that infrastructure, as an example, what we see in cybersecurity, is end of life. There's no software support. The hardware is end of life. And that's one of the key things. If you know that you've got vulnerabilities or there's a platform that could impact business during downtime, that could be seen as the negligence threshold. But it really comes into, if we look at the protection levels, is you'll see there's quite a good correlation between protection levels as well as the loss of the exposure of the data or the platforms. The key thing from protection is you might have controls in place, but are the controls being measured? Is the control effective? So it talks to, from a communication, whatever channels you use, those digital online platforms. The loss exposure looks at the frequency of these events. And I'm going to take you just high level through, as an example, some different frameworks when we engage with departments that security teams are adopting now to actually translate cyber risk into your business risk. Now, we all know there's compliance levels out. You've got all the different regulations. But some of the key stats that's been found is if you look at compliance, it's not typically from an audit perspective. You've got your controls, as I mentioned, but they're not necessarily meeting the objectives. They are not being measured. So are these controls that's in place required in the business, or does it lead to, I think Isak spoke on it, and I'm going to touch on that a bit, is around where you can start leveraging AI and ChatGPT. Just by a show of hands, how many of you have actually used ChatGPT? And there's definitely benefits in terms of your productivity, right? Don't know if you've noticed that. Now, I was working with I'm part of a global, what we call ethical white hat hacking group, and there are so many different versions of it out now, specifically with malicious intent. I'm not endorsing it, but it's called Worm GPT. There's now Fraud GPT, because ChatGPT gives you the ability, if you want to do anything that could be biased or with malicious intent, it's actually going to respond to you in that manner. With these different versions now, attackers are using the same technology that we use to increase productivity with malicious intent. So it's really around how do you comply and apply those principles. Risk tolerance level. Now, as you've identified your risk profile, where's the biggest risk, high, critical, medium, it really comes down to what's the acceptable risk tolerance level? What are the business outcomes, the business drivers that you want to achieve? And what's the cost associated with meeting those objectives? Now, a good analogy I like to use here is my nephew often comes over to us, and we all know the youngsters. He makes himself breakfast while put a piece of toast in, turns the TV on, and all of a sudden that toast burns. 15 minutes for me to pick that up in my house, that's probably acceptable risk tolerance level. I mean, the house won't burn down, but when he moves to actually frying an egg, whatever the case might be, that's now a flame over gas. 15 minutes, is it acceptable? I probably could. It won't cause my house to burn down, but you know what, 10 minutes is probably my acceptable risk tolerance level. And when the entire kitchen's on fire, 15 minutes, that's too late. And this is really the analogy I like to use is identifying what your risk posture is within the organization and what the tolerance level is, because that's going to determine where the strategy goes, which in effective would lead to procurement finances that needs to be approved, etc. Now, when we look at it, it's really around when you understand what your biggest risk surface is, that leads to defining what your strategy is within the organization. We all know I've been fortunate enough as well to work with procurement teams in my previous life, and we always think from a technical cyber perspective that procurement and finance teams don't want to approve budgets, but the key thing is they need to govern in terms of which solutions are being purchased, and is there really a big business driver? Is there a risk that needs to be mitigated? So as you go on your strategy, it really assists you in how do you prevent these outages, brand reputation. We all know that when an organization experiences a breach, what's the confidence? Do you move to the alternative? Do you go to a different higher education department as an example? And that's typically why these attackers do it. They also want to cause disruption. We look at this from an entire methodology is around how do you ensure working protected? Because you need to protect the intersection between communications, which could be email. That's still that number one biggest threat vector out there. Once again, students' accounts are not secured as an example. So attackers leverage that to send out malicious campaigns internal. So it looks like it's come from Johan. I work with someone in a different department in higher education. It's been seen as trustworthy, right? People, the emotion aspect, protecting the identity of the individual, whether it's a faculty or student, but really becoming a culture change through policies, what we call continuous awareness training programs, and data. Now, data, once again, that could lead to a lot of these additional fines. I think we've all seen the last year, especially in South Africa, some of these departments that are now penalties are being applied, fined in terms of, from a POPI perspective, because of the negligence. The negligence threshold was identified, they were aware, and that's how the breach came in. It was never as part of the risk mitigation, it was never rectified. So from this aspect, it's really around looking into budget procurement and the increased risk. Now, this is high level, what we call a cyber kill chain, and as you can see, reconnaissance, this is also what we see as what you call a military grade word from a reconnaissance perspective. Attackers start identifying who they want to target in the organization. Campaigns, which university as an example. And the key thing is point number 3. That's when they start delivering these malicious mails or different content types over what I've seen of late, and I know probably most of us in here in the room uses Microsoft Teams. It's not a Microsoft problem. Because they're the biggest target out there, they are being attacked. I mean, the adoption of the entire productivity suite has really made all of our lives easier, where we can work whether hybrid or remotely from everywhere in the world, with the objective of point number 4 and 7. So once they've exposed, they've identified the target, they really get to delivering, they craft that specific cyber attack. Once again, emotions or exposing vulnerabilities. So when we look at all of us, we're on our mobile phones, we all quickly reply to a WhatsApp, whatever the case might be. It's what you see in the real world as well from a work ethic perspective. People start replying to emails, click on links, because that's the pressure everybody's under. With the key objective, number 7 is getting the data out. They start exfiltrating it through unsanctioned channels, cloud applications, cloud storage applications. Now, the reason I've taken you through this is really to just give you a high level how a cyber kill chain works. So from a cybersecurity team, for them to be able to come up with a strategy, it's really around they need to identify, do a risk assessment, because that would lead to a strategy, and from a finance and procurement perspective to identify, are these the high risks or which risks are accepted in terms of the tolerance level to mitigate. Now, this is nothing new within South Africa. A lot of higher education departments, public sector are following this framework. And the 3 frameworks I'm going to take you through, it's not necessarily the one is good. There is one that's better than the other, but a lot of more mature environments, organizations, are now actually correlating all 3 as part of it. But you'll see a lot of these from a NIST framework is around there's people, there's processes, as well as technology that forms part of it. So as you start working on your cybersecurity teams, your operational teams start working on a risk profile, they start identifying where are the gaps. I typically like to use an analogy. If you look at a block of Swiss cheese, there's those little air gap holes. The key thing is a lot of these solutions that gets put in is there to cover a specific point of risk in the organization. So that still leaves you open as an organization. However, following these frameworks really starts identifying those different risks. The next is really around where you've got a security team that gets driven around intelligence, cyber intelligence. And this really takes it to the next level. Attacks, and I see this quite often, is, let's say in the US, there might be an attack now. Oh, we're never going to be targeting South Africa. It's a matter of time before they start spreading those attacks to South African education departments. And it's the analogies, I'm going back to Joburg tonight. If I phone my wife and ask her, how's the weather in Joburg? She might think, well, you're not here yet, it's irrelevant to you. You're getting into your car when you leave the airport. That's the same analogy. From a cyber attack is having intelligence, what is happening all over the world geographically, being prepared when those attacks come in. And that's really what this framework defines, because that leads into your overall cyber strategy. And then from a finance team perspective, actually correlating the quantitative around this framework, which is called the FAIR. It really gives you the ability to go deeper into identifying the quantity of cyber attacks against your department and correlating a cost around what's the exposure around financial loss, reputational damage. Now, reputational damage is quite a difficult aspect to associate a cost to, but this framework gives you that ability from a security team to apply that, and that really comes down to translating cyber risk to business risk. As well as vulnerabilities, as I mentioned, it's not just about a cyber attack. The intent might not be to exfiltrate data. It's to cause disruption, downtime. Students can't do online examinations. That leads to a negative effect emotionally on the students. So these are just some three of the top-level frameworks that cybersecurity teams start to follow to actually start applying the strategy that when they get to procurement, there's really a clear identified communication channel in terms of what the threat is and what the associated risk and costs are with that. Cybersecurity burnout. And I don't think this is just in cybersecurity. I think all of us, the ones that didn't have a late night last night, probably worked till late hours, catching up on email, and I think that's just the general challenge we're all facing. Everybody's working longer hours. But from a cybersecurity perspective, we're seeing this quite often. It's what we call the force multiplier. Cyber skills shortages. It's a real thing in South Africa. We are losing a lot of skills where they are immigrating to different countries all over the world. But the key thing really comes into, as part of education, we need to take the young population, like Isaac mentioned earlier, is to actually get them skilled up, because that really invests in their future, the growth. Machine speed learning is a lot of these cybersecurity consultants are now they just finished their degree. They are overwhelmed in terms of how quick it is to detect a threat. How do you actually respond to it and remediate it? Because machine speed learning and machine speed remediation is much faster than the human element. Doesn't matter at which skill level. SOC data flow, I'm just going to skip on because that's really around what we call alert fatigue. Good example is you log onto your laptop and you get a pop-up that says you're not allowed to go to this website or there are updates outstanding. Typically, that's what security teams are facing. They are getting thousands of alerts every day, and they really can't cope. They don't know what to focus on. They start spending more time on focusing on managing technology and not managing the risk, mitigating the risk. And that's a real fact what we're seeing. Now, where's AI and machine learning is really a big buzzword, but it's something we all use. And really looking at how cyber attackers are using fraud GPT, worm GPT, it's fighting fire with fire. Absolutely. These are different areas in the cybersecurity framework where AI and machine learning is being used to combat these more sophisticated attacks. It's really around those early stages in a cyber attack. Can you detect it before it actually gets weaponized? There are many solutions out there, because the sooner you're aware, the sooner you can take it down. Now, anyone, just take a guess. What's the average amount of websites, URLs that are created per second every day? I was overwhelmed. Per second. So the latest stats that's been found is 11 domains and websites are created every 11 seconds. Now, 70% of them are with malicious intent, but typically they don't have a bad reputation. What they are doing is they are cloning those trusted brands. So students log onto a portal to log in, get to their student portal. Attackers are cloning those websites to actually compromise their identities. The students or even faculty enter your credentials. They use logos we all trust on a daily basis. That's the biggest risk. How do you identify that? And that's really around using artificial intelligence and machine learning to identify these, what we call lookalike attacks in the early stages, because that would prevent any disruption or reputational damage, with a key objective, financial damage. I think one thing as well is, I have a lot of conversations where people are like, well, I'm going to be out of a job in 2 years, ChatGPT is going to force me out of my job. However, it's key to understand that AI and machine learning augments your cybersecurity strategy. It doesn't replace the people aspect. You still need someone to actually identify, is this a false positive? Is it a real attack? Because as you, the ones of you that use ChatGPT, the more you prompt it, you can confuse it, that it actually gives you output that's not expected. Toolset and intelligence, that's really around what we call the intelligence that you've got, because you know exactly how your business operates, different platforms, whether it's cloud apps, use it on mobile devices, multiple devices, is gathering intelligence when something anomaly is detected. That's the key thing from AI and machine learning, is not to take away that alert fatigue on your end users, your security teams. Only apply a greater alert and an incident when anomaly behavior is detected. Whether it's, I can't, as an example, be in Cape Town, but all of a sudden I log in, someone's trying to get into my account, or I have logged in from, say, Brazil. That's anomaly, because it works on the artificial intelligence that starts following you. You can physically not get to that country within 2-3 minutes. So that's really the key thing. Use the intelligence, but it augments your existing security. Now, when we look at where to use AI, and this, I think, talks across the entire business, not just cybersecurity, but focusing on cybersecurity is to close that skill shortage gap. Automation. Security teams don't have to go log into 10, 30 platforms to go and see, oh, Johan logged in here, this is his device. It's using the intelligence and automation to actually, well, disable Johan's account at that point of risk. Don't let him get access to sensitive data. Those research projects, which are probably seen as sensitive within higher education departments, and then ending off as part of a defense in-depth approach. It's really around take a more proactive defense and lessen the load on your security team, so when they come back to procurement departments and submit finance requests, that you've got a clear, defined process around these are the accountable departments, the risk is registered on the risk register, and which part of your strategy are going to be focused on mitigating those risks in a preventive manner. And then lastly, before I send you off to have a good few refreshments, is around when we look at vendors as part of your vendor selection, is what we're seeing is a lot of organizations are now getting to the stage around where they're following an interconnected mesh architecture. Now, I'm sure all of us probably use Netflix somewhere in our life. You've got a mobile, you've got your smart TV at home, internet of connectivity, is how all these platforms interconnect from mobile. You still get the same experience. So from a mesh architecture perspective, it's really around, as you invest in solutions, it's from a vendor selection, their strategy should be what we call an open API framework. Ensure that all the different platforms are interconnected. That takes away that load on your security team, the resources, and automation with a single dashboard, console, they can go see, these are the attacks. I don't know what happened there. Okay, well, that was my last slide, with a key objective around, you know what, we all need to, it becomes a community of defense, is working protecting the intersection of communications, the people aspect, when they're emotional or they want to be targeted, as well as the data. Sensitive data needs to be protected and control access when required. I thank you.